Three, two, one, here we go. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian the Rain Man Lucas. Welcome to RAINMAN'S Take, observations on the world we live in. We're going to take a deeper dive into topics of interest to me, including politics, current events, history, popular culture, and social issues. You'll find the diversity of topics refreshing. In our clickbait, soundbite society, we rarely get the whole story. RAINMAN'S Take interviews interesting people as well as peeling back the onion on specific topics, all with the goal of getting people to think more deeply about a subject. I'd like to welcome back Marine Corps combat veteran and award-winning author, Dan Sheehan. Dan, it's good to see you again. How you doing?
Oh, doing great. Thanks, Brian. How about you?
I'm well, thanks. I'm well. So before we get going in today's episode, if you missed last week's podcast, Dan and I spent quite a bit of time going over his experiences in combat in Iraq, both as a Cobra attack helicopter pilot and a forward air controller for a special operations unit. It was longer than normal, but I think it's well worth watching the entire thing. We spent about the last 15 minutes of last week's episode talking about his transition from a warrior to an author, using his experiences during and after the war to write his first book, After Action. So Dan, why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. If you could just refresh a little bit about what happened after you wrote After Action, and then how long after that did you write Continuing Action? Give us kind of a little bit of a interplay between what happened between the two books.
Sure. So After Action came out, published After Action in 2012, and we were still living in Virginia, suburbs of DC at that time. And, I really figured that I really thought I'd figured out a lot of things throughout the cathartic process of writing After Action. And I really, After Action ends with me discovering kind of this kernel of unease, what was causing my unease from my combat experiences and what had come home with me. And through writing, I was able to pull that out into the light and see it and understand it. And, I hit on it and said, that's it. That's why I feel the way I do. And what I found, I was under the impression that I was it, that I was done. That, hey, I found it. I'm good. And what came to light for me, and it came to light over several years, was that I had figured out what was bothering me, but I hadn't quite put it to bed. And the concept of putting it to bed in and of itself is a misnomer. You never quite put it to bed. It's always there. You learn how to deal with it though, and you learn how to incorporate it into your life using mitigation techniques and using things that I bring up in the second book. So the impetus for starting my second book, which is titled Continuing Actions, was the realization that I wasn't done. I'd figured some stuff out, but I wasn't done yet. There was more that I needed to do. And in my own personal journey, that involved my wife and kids and I moving back to Southern California and seeking kind of a bit of geographic, let's say a change of pace to shake myself up a little bit, or at least get back to some of the physical activities that were very cathartic for me, which helped me process things on the backside of my first couple of tours in Iraq. We were able to do that. We were able to get back to SoCal. And it was only after that didn't work that I went, you know what? I guess it's time to go talk to somebody. And I did. I went into the vet centers here out at San Marcos, and I've mentioned it in the last podcast, but the vet centers are set up for combat veterans and victims of sexual trauma in the military. And my experience with the San Marcos Vet Center was extremely positive. Now, a lot of that came from the fact that I walked in there the first day, and the first day I met with my counselor, and I dropped all my shit on his desk and said, listen, help me figure this out. I don't know what's going on, but this is what I've figured out myself, and this is where I'm at. And, so I went in there as much of an open book as I think a counselor ever gets.
Yeah.
But he was able to help me out and help me out very quickly, and gave me just that little bit of outside help that I needed to help reinforce what I had already done.
Right.
And sometimes that's all it takes. It's just a couple of conversations.
Yeah.
So after that, I settled in. Now I know that now I'm fully aware that there's more that I need to do, and there's more to this journey that I need to discuss. And then I settled out on to begin working on the second book. So it was about 2 years after the first one that I began working on continuing actions.
I imagine you probably, when you walked in there with your book, when you walked in with After Action, dropped that on the desk with him, I imagine you probably thought, okay, this kid's probably done a lot more than most in terms of at least starting to address it. Because at least the people that I know that have felt like they're feeling the effects of PTSD, it is just almost like an afterthought. And you kind of talk a little bit about that in continuing actions. But they don't want to address it, or they can't, or they don't know how. Whereas you walk in with 300 pages already, starting to do the self-diagnosis. The guy had to have been impressed, I guess.
Well, I think he appreciated it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd go with impressed, but he appreciated the fact that I didn't try to hide stuff from him, because a lot of the things that counselors have to do is they have to pull this stuff out of people.
Yeah.
A lot of these things are painful memories, and they've been compartmentalized for a reason. And so the counselors are stuck in a position of playing detective and counselor at the same time. And so I just was able to help him by taking away one of those hats. He didn't have to play detective with me. I was an open book for him. I was like, just help me figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure we'll go into it a little bit more detail throughout the conversation here, but that's one of the big things that you talk about is, there's 3 levels of taking care of yourself. The first one being taking care of yourself by yourself, and then moving on from there. So, okay. So you go in, you really start to figure out, hey, I need to do more. How did you get hooked up with Dr. Shea? And tell us a little bit about, because you mentioned him briefly at the end of the last episode, but the guy is definitely very important in this field. And so I'm just curious, how did you get in touch with him? And obviously the relationship blossomed to the point where he wrote the foreword to your book, Continuing Actions.
It did. So I reached out to Dr. Shea about a year before the manuscript was ready to share with anyone, when I was still putting it together. I started the process from the standpoint of, I started my writing process from the standpoint of do no harm. Like I had ideas about what worked for me, but I wanted to be very sure that what I was recommending other folks do was not going to be harmful in any way. And when you start getting into psychology, you can think one thing is, hey, this was great. And then somebody else reads it and goes, wow, are you trying to kill someone? So I was very cognizant of that. I am not a mental health professional at all. And what I have gleaned from the works of mental health professionals gave me a lot of insight into what I was going through. But my professional experience is just reading, basically. And so I started working to line up psychiatrists and psychologists who would look at my work and give me that sort of feedback from a professional standpoint as to whether what I was saying was either helpful or potentially harmful. And so Dr. Shea was one of the first, because when I was writing After Action, this is going to go on for a moment. Somebody just knocked on the door, so you want to pause?
Sure.
All right, let me go check on that.
All right.
I'll be right back.
Yep.
Hey, who is it?
Play 3, 2, 1.
So I linked up with Jonathan Shea, Dr. Shea, after reading his books, Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. And I read those when I was researching After Action. And just the way that he portrayed, or the way that he pulled apart the classics of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and made things in those classics resonate with me and my experiences, really opened my eyes to the power of mythology, and it showed me that there's a lot more behind what I was feeling than just, oh, I went to war and came home. Like, there's a whole unconscious, there's a whole series of conflicts going on there that I saw as external, but were really internal conflicts as well. So not to get too deep in the matter at this point, but I reached out to Dr. Shea when I started writing, through, actually, ironically enough, through LinkedIn. We were randomly connected through somebody who I don't even remember who it was. And we started up a conversation, and I hit him up with a request about a year out, just saying, this is what I'm working on. This is what I need from a professional like yourself. Would you be interested in just reviewing my work and letting me know if it's good or potentially harmful?
Yeah.
And he came back with sure, hit me up when you're ready. And so when I had the manuscript well and truly polished, I reached out to him again, and he was very gracious, took the manuscript and read it very quickly, and got back to me with some recommendations, specifically on sleep and the importance of sleep, that I incorporated into the continuing actions, and emphasized more strongly in the final draft of continuing actions. And then as we went back and forth after that, towards the end of that process, I asked him if he would be willing to provide a front cover copy blurb, Dan's work is great, you should read it.
Right. Right.
And he went one step further, or significantly farther, and he wrote the foreword for it, a very flattering and very supportive foreword that I'm in his debt for doing.
Nice. So we're talking with Dan Sheehan, Marine Corps combat veteran and author. You can see Dan at www.dansheehanauthor.com and pick up his books, After Action and Continuing Actions, on Amazon. So let's talk. We're definitely going to get into the whole Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey here in a second, because that I found that stuff fascinating. But let's talk about. I guess this is probably going to dovetail right into that part of the conversation. So you talk about. Well, you briefly touch on it in the book about how ancient cultures, how the warriors were viewed in ancient cultures going all the way back, and how that they kind of knew that the warriors would be different, and it was just part of the whole society that they would help. If I read this correctly, the whole society would help that warrior come back and try to get himself back into being a part of that society. And somewhere along the lines, it seems like our modern society has changed in the sense that they don't do that to the modern warriors coming home. Am I on the mark there, or is that?
You are. You're right on the mark. And one of the aspects of the research that I did for continuing actions brought me to this point where I was getting I was able to find a lot of information about how quote unquote primitive cultures had rites and ceremonies to welcome their warriors home. And these rites and ceremonies, these dances, sweat lodge, these meetings of the entire clan or entire group served to or share the burden that the warrior came home with across the entire society that the warrior went to fight for. Now, it was difficult to find any concrete explanations about what these were, except in there were some good examples in Tom Holmes's book, drawing a blank, Strong Hearts, Wounded Souls, which examines Native American cultures and how they welcomed Vietnam veterans back, and some of the experiences that Vietnam veterans, who were also Native Americans, had when they came home from Vietnam, right, and how that was different than maybe the vast majority of Vietnam veterans' experiences, because they did have some of those culturally significant customs and ceremonies to help alleviate the combat trauma. Yeah. Now, one of the things that I came to each time that I got around this was that these were small, relatively homogeneous groups. So these are clans, these are tribes, these are families, these are extended groups for whom the warriors' sacrifices meant life or death. The tribe was going to be wiped out if the warrior wasn't able to do what he went to do. Right. The tribe was going to lose the hunting ground that they needed. Whatever it was, the tribe was going to suffer if that warrior didn't do the vile things that war requires. And yes, Native Americans placed a higher value, in some tribes placed a higher value on counting coup than on actually taking life. However, lives were taken and injuries were sustained, and those warriors could not just come back into polite society, right, as if nothing had happened. Right. They needed a gateway. They were sent out by the society through a gateway to go in and do some vile things that are required in war. Then they had to come back through that same gateway in order to be absolved of that, cleansed of that, and then brought back into society. Now, these culturally significant ceremonies are only significant because they take place amongst that homogeneous group. They share the same values, they share the same belief structures, and these sorts of ceremonies are imbued in the culture. Right. We don't have that. And we're not a homogeneous society. We're a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different folks, and the extent of our welcome home ceremony is barbecues on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Right. You know, that's not sufficient, and those were never the intentions for those days. Those are that's a bit flippant on my part, but the basic fact remains that our modern warriors are sent out through the gates of the military to go do something overseas. Sometimes that's quite vile, what we have to do. And then there's no return home for that. There's no burden sharing. There's no time when the entire society gets together and goes, pats you on the shoulder, and you really see, hey, you know what? Nobody ever comes to that warrior and goes, what you did, what you had to do, you did for me. And I thank you for that. And I know that has taken a lot out of you. I know that it has cost you this or that or this. And I'm sorry, but I thank you. Yeah. And that's the beginning, if you will, of that ceremony and what those warriors would then get to go through. When that burden becomes a societal burden and it gets taken off the shoulders of that warrior, it then becomes something that the warrior can process and go, I'm not this vile person. I did this for us. I did this so that we could have what we have. Yeah. And that realization is also missing from us, from our experience, because it's hard to it's hard to look at what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan and gone, you know what, somebody in Des Moines, Iowa, really had an iron in the fire over there with me. Because if I didn't do what I did, then, well, I'm not sure what would have happened in Des Moines.
Yeah.
But you get my drift. This is something that has been borne by a very small segment of our population. And so we honestly cannot come home. We as veterans cannot come home and expect our society to be able to share that burden with us.
Yeah.
They can't. They don't understand it. And so how can they share it?
Yeah.
So the burden falls on our shoulders to do it ourselves. And that's what Continuing Actions is all about. It's how you can do this yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and then take that societal acceptance from those other cultures, and then the flip side of the coin, which is crazy now that you just were kind of talking about this, was how the Vietnam veterans were treated when they got back. I mean, it's unbelievable, that not only were they not welcome back, but I mean, the abuse that they took was just incredible.
Well, one of the things that I came to realize, as through writing 2 books on the subject, I spent a lot of time staring at my own belly button, figuring stuff out in my own head, and came to realize just how large of a debt that I and that our cohort of veterans owes the Vietnam veterans. Yeah. Because we came home in a situation where we didn't have to fight for our rights. Now there have been some legislative things that have happened.
Right.
And the post 9/11 GI Bill is very gracious and all that. But what I'm getting at is we didn't come home and face an outpouring of anger against the war directed at us. The Vietnam veterans, through their suffering, really helped us by allowing the American people to wrap their brains around separating the warrior from the war. Yeah. And that's something that only came about off of their traumas and their struggles and the shit way they were treated when they came home. Yeah. And I thank all the Vietnam veterans for what they went through and what they've done to make my coming home much more successful than it otherwise could have been.
Yeah, yeah, and this is just my personal take, and I'm not sure how you feel about it, but my personal take is I think it would be different if, like, our parents back in the day, or our parents or our grandparents, where everybody had some compulsory public service, whether it was compulsory in the military or, a year or 2 in the military or the Peace Corps or whatever it was. If everybody had at least gotten just a dabbling of it, maybe this would be a little bit different. But, right now, with how small the forces are in the United States relative to the total population, and the fact that it's an all voluntary force, yeah, it definitely kind of puts them out there on an island in terms of the cultural understanding of what they've had to go through.
Right.
So interesting. So let's talk a little bit about you. I really enjoyed how so Joseph Campbell, talk a little bit about him. You had started off with, his philosophy about the hero's journey, but you talk about how that can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, that word hero, and how you think that, or you thought that maybe the word warrior or something along those lines, something different than the mythical hero, would be a better way to kind of deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. And then Joseph Campbell was a comparative mythologist who studied cultures and mythologies from disparate cultures across the world and throughout different periods of history, and boiled a lot of them down into their basic components. And one of his, and he's got a lot of incredible books out. There's The Power of Myth is one. And then The Hero with 1,000 Faces is another. These are books that take his work and boil it down into its main component, which is that there's something in our mythologies, our human mythologies, that is unconscious and is part of the human archetype. And it's, these are myths that sprung up in disparate parts of the world, in the icy north, and also the isolated island in the South Pacific. They have similar heroes' journeys. They have these similar creation myths. All these things, they didn't come up from trading together. They didn't get together and paddle themselves into a meeting to talk about cultures and get stuff together. No, these things just happened organically across the globe in the various disparate cultures. Now, I found that fascinating and went to read more about it. And that's when I came upon his explanation of the hero's myth. The hero's journey. Now, his work provided me with a foundation to then go further into psychology and various other authors' works on psychology, and really kind of tied things together for me. Yeah. But like you said, the word hero is a loaded word for a lot of us, because it's thrown around too often, and it's cheapened by being thrown around too often. And one of the primary things that you have to do as an author is you have to connect with your audience. And if I told every veteran, hey, guess what? You're a hero and you got to read this book and learn how to do this sort of stuff, I would have lost them at hero. Because that's just, you're not going to get me to go, yeah, okay, I'm a hero, so let me figure out how to deal with it.
Right. Right.
And even warrior has a tinge to it, because Google warrior sometime and it's going to pop up with a whole bunch of books about the tribe of cats and video games. Yeah. That's what you're going to find.
Yeah.
And that's what our culture does with words. However, I figured that warrior was a safer bet than hero for this book. So I just drew that parallel early on in continuing actions and said, listen, bear with me. I got to put something on this. I'm going to call it the warrior's journey, and let's go forward from there. And the basic gist of the warrior's journey is just like Campbell describes. It's a 3-part adventure in which it's a 3-part journey, and you don't come back to where you started. You are necessarily transformed by the journey. Yeah. A journey that doesn't transform you isn't a journey. It's a series of adventures that if you don't learn anything from it, then you may end up back where you were, but you're changed and you have better figure out how you're changed. The cultural components of the hero's journey provide a framework for that transformation, the transformation that occurs during that journey. And what I found was that in my own personal experience, I was very well prepared for the first 2 phases of that journey. I was very well prepared for the initiation, for separating from my culture, from my society, and joining the Marine Corps. That was my separation. That was me raising my hand and say, I'll go. I accept this, and I want to go and do something meaningful. So I accepted that challenge, and I went to OCS and went on to serve from there. Now, the adventures, the second phase of that, are the adventures in the unknown. And for me, my adventures they spanned peacetime operations. They spanned training, peacetime operations, and also combat operations, and then time in between combat, and then more combat operations. And so my adventures had that flavor to them, but that's just my adventures. That doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that if you only served in peacetime, you don't have adventures. Of course you do. And those adventures are adventures outside the realm of most of Americans can comprehend. And certainly beyond the realm of what most Americans are willing to take on. And so just because you served in peacetime does not mean that you have not had adventures, does not mean that you are not fulfilling that second step of this journey.
Right.
Now, what drove me to, wouldn't call it a thesis, but what drove me to write Continuing Actions the way that I did was the realization that that's where my preparation ended. That's where my understanding of the warrior's journey ended, was in combat. And that was it. It was like, boom, turn in your weapon, wash your gear, head home, and you're done.
Yeah.
You made it. That's all you need to do. Woo! Let's have some beers and steaks and hang out. It's like, that's not what happens.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know that there were challenges associated with coming home. I didn't even know there was an entire additional third of this journey that I had yet to even think about, let alone navigate.
Yeah.
And that became, filling that gap became my goal in writing. And I'd already written the first book, but writing the second was really trying to take what I had learned and provide it in a readable format that's accessible. And I say accessible because, I didn't conduct any brilliant leaps of knowledge. I didn't add anything brilliant to the psychological world with Continuing Actions. All I did was I read a lot from people who spent decades in this field, and I applied their knowledge to my personal experiences and tried to translate it in a way that would be something that I would have picked up before I started all this. And so I saw a lot of what I was doing as translating what a scholar would say, that a scholar needs to use certain words and needs to use as to deal with language with a certain respect that's required by their profession. I didn't have to worry about that. So if I wanted to throw a dick or a fart joke in there, I did. And if I needed to do something that would draw a concept down into the profane so that we could apply it to our own lives, then I did. And that was my goal in using the language I did and in the work itself.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it worked, because knuckle draggers like me could really understand it and could definitely relate to it. And real quick, Dan just said a lot right there, but he kind of glossed over what his adventures were. So if you're interested in what Dan's adventures were, definitely go back and look at last week's podcast, because he gets into great detail about those adventures. So let's talk a little bit about one of the parts of the book that really caught my attention was when you were talking about comparing apples to oranges, and we'll get into that in a second, go into more detail. But I found it's essentially saying, it's not a good thing to compare your combat experience to somebody else's combat experience. So the way I was looking at that was, I remember, when we were over in Iraq, you had the guys that were out flying, that fly over the fence line and go do the thing. But in the back, you've got all the maintenance, all the support, all the admin, all those people. They're still in a combat zone. They're still having to duck under, their desks when they hear the incoming horn going off. And probably relatively early on after we got back in 2005, I remember hearing about one of the kids that was just having some trouble kind of getting back into society, and he was one of those admin type, support type personnel. And as I look back on it now, especially after having read that section of the book, I feel really bad about my initial gut feeling was, how could he be? He was basically in an admin position over there. I had trouble understanding how that could affect somebody. And you go into that in the book, the section about comparing apples to oranges. So do me a favor, just kind of go into that a little bit if you could, and because I think that's valuable.
Well, one of the first hurdles that we have to overcome in our own minds is this concept of a hierarchy of suffering. You know, I didn't have it as bad as he did, so I don't have anything to be worried about. I don't have anything to deal with because that guy had it a whole lot worse than I did, and he looks fine. Yeah. So I must be fine too. And conversely, it goes the opposite direction too. It's just like you described. It can be, what the hell's wrong with you? You didn't do this. I did this, and I'm better, and I'm fine. Or, you know, even if it doesn't go to that place, to that level, you're still going, really? You got problems? And that hierarchy of suffering is something that is difficult to overcome because it is so ingrained. And it's something that's ingrained within us from the first day of boot camp or OCS. You start learning about the Chosin Reservoir, you know, you start learning about Tarawa, and you learn about all these battles in the Marines' history of just incredible suffering and incredible fortitude and what these guys did. And then you see them going, okay, and then they came home and yeah, sure, some of them had problems. Who wouldn't? But I didn't have any of those. I use the example of slithering through the tunnels in Cu-Chi. You know, that sounds like hell to me. That sounds like it would melt my brain if I had to do that. And these men, you know, did that for a long time. And a lot of them died, and a lot of them have probably died since they came home and from those experiences. And that's the sort of thing that you put up there on your hierarchy of suffering and go, I'm nowhere near that. Right. So I'm fine. I can handle what I've been through. Yeah. But you don't get to make that decision. That's not a conscious decision that you get to make. And one of the things that I describe in detail in the book is about this chasm that develops between your conscious brain and your unconscious. And you usually start with those two relatively talking together. They're they speak the same volume, speak the same language, and you kind of, let's say, you can operate pretty well with them both in sequence. But what happens when you get into combat, when you get into a stressful situation, and I'm not going to use combat all that, I would prefer not to use combat all that much because that's just one example of an experience which requires you to use something called compartmentalization. We talked about it a little bit before. Yep. But compartmentalization is anything you have to do to draw your emotions away from the reality of what you're doing at that moment, stuff them in the back, and drive on with what you're supposed to be doing. So if you're an ambulance driver and you're driving down the street and a dog runs in front of the ambulance and you floor a dog, and then you got to get to the hospital with your patient, you're not going to sit there crying about the dog while you're still trying to navigate the roads to get the patient to the hospital. Right. You're going to compartmentalize that. Now, if you're smart, you're going to take that out afterwards and you're going to let it go. But that's the part that I get to. So anyways, each of these events that happen, traumatic events which require your compartmentalization, they separate your conscious and unconscious minds a little bit more each time, and they get out of phase with each other because your conscious mind isn't experiencing the rage, the fear, the anger, the whatever emotion you're compartmentalizing, it's not experiencing it because you've taken it, you've channeled it, and you've sent it away. Now, your unconscious, however, is like a sponge. It's sitting there going, oh, man, that sucks. I love dogs, and I just whacked one. Yeah. Man, I can't. What am I doing? Yeah. But you're not listening to that because you're doing this is what's in control. And so you're going. Well, what happens is these two get farther and farther apart, and eventually you don't know what this guy's doing. Your conscious brain is going, okay, now we're going to a baseball game, and this is going to be fun. I'm going to have a good time. Your unconscious mind is sitting in the background while you're driving the kids down to the ballpark, and a dog runs out in front of the car. You slam on the brakes, and now all of a sudden you're in that place, and you're like, holy shit, what just happened? Yeah. Because this is now bubbling up. And in your mind, you just ran over that dog, you're skinning it, whatever just happened.
Right.
All that's bubbling up into your baseball game, and your kids are going, Dad, what the hell's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You didn't even get on the street. That's the disconnect that occurs between our conscious and unconscious minds in a stressful situation. Now, compartmentalization is a tourniquet. It helps us out. It keeps us alive. But it does this. It separates you. Just like if you put a tourniquet on your arm, this hand is going to look pretty damn bad pretty quick, okay? Now, it might save me from bleeding out, but I got to get somewhere and I got to get that taken off. Right. Otherwise, I'm going to lose this arm.
Yeah.
Well, that analogy continues out to your conscious and unconscious minds. And the only way to bring these two guys back together, closer, so they can talk together, is decompartmentalization. You got to pull that stuff out of those memories. You got to pull the emotions out. You got to give them a chance to run because they didn't get it the first time. Yeah. You didn't protect yourself from them. You still absorbed those emotions. All you did was stuff them away in a dark room in the back of your head, and then locked the door on them and said, "I'm done.
Right.
I'm fine. I don't need to think about that." Well, you do, because you've got this chasm. Now you need to be able to close that chasm and bring your conscious and unconscious minds back together. And there are pragmatic ways to do that I outline in continuing action. You got to find those, you got to figure out how to open those doors in your own mind and pull that stuff out into the light and experience it. It's not pleasant. You have to let those emotions come out. And it's kind of like lancing a boil. You know, that's pretty gross stuff, but that's the only way to get it out.
And the last episode, we talked a lot about how you did that with going back into your logbooks and your notes after missions and just kind of rehashing everything. And it's just amazing. So let me ask you, Dan, after you wrote that book, what was sort of the reaction of because I would assume you had a lot of veterans read it, you had a lot of the medical personnel read it. What was the feedback?
It was very positive. I was very pleased with how the book was received, both by mental health professionals and family members of veterans and veterans themselves. It's humbling when somebody writes to you and says, "Hey, you helped me understand why my dad was the way he was. You know, he died X number of years ago, and you've given me you've given me the ability to forgive him because I understand now where some of that stuff came from." And I mean, that feels really good when you get that sort of feedback.
Absolutely.
And from professionals who work in the mental health facilities, you know, I've been really pleased with that as well. I've had several friends who took my books to their counselors and said, "Hey, you need to read this. You need to use this." And I hope it's still being used in that regard.
Oh man, that's great. That's great. Yeah. Again, I'm speaking with Dan Sheehan, Marine Corps combat vet and author of the books After Action and Continuing Actions. Again, you can look up Dan at www.dansheehanauthor.com, and you can buy both those books on Amazon. And that's really cool. We were just talking about that person who it helped them to better understand their parent. So this book it's not just for vets. I mean, anybody can get a lot out of it. So that speaks highly of the book.
Thanks.
So, all right. So
one of the things I wanted to do with it was to get it to provide a starting point for people to start these sorts of conversations in their own household, you know, and if very, very frequently a wife or a husband understands that their partner is different than they were, but doesn't know how to broach the subject even, how to bring it up. And I wrote both my books to provide that sort of initial starting point of a discussion. And I hope that they continue to do that, to be able to facilitate these sorts of discussions, because the only way you get this stuff out is by talking about it. And if you've got someone in your life who can help you by listening, then you're ahead of the game.
Did you, after these books, did you do any type of public speaking or speak to groups about this?
I did. I was invited out to Penn State on a couple of occasions, my alma mater, and so I spoke to the ROTC battalion out there, as well as I spoke during a festival that Penn State held one year. Besides that, I've done some Vietnam veterans, the Vietnam Veterans of America post, gave a talk with those gentlemen. And then unfortunately, once we moved out to California, my ability to get back to accept a couple of invitations to speak at the Naval Academy and the Marine Corps, the museum, those things I wasn't able to swing those, but it was nice to be invited. Nice.
I'm just going to ask this just because this was a very poignant part of the book where you talk about you had given a draft to I think it was one of your father's buddies who they flew together in Vietnam. The guy had some pretty negative, not so much negative, but he was kind of like, how can these young kids, that have only gone through a couple of weeks of combat, how can they, feel like we did, who, spent years in it. Did that guy did he ever come around? Did he ever kind of understand what you were trying to get at, or how'd that all work out?
No, and it was slightly more ancillary than that. It was a Amazon review that was posted, and he never responded after that. I don't recall whether I actually responded to him either. Yeah. But what his response was that classic apples to oranges, like, I had it harder, I had it worse than you did, so what the hell's wrong with you? And I included that because it does help to solidify the point that it doesn't matter whether you were in Fallujah in 2004 or in Anchorage, Alaska at a base and somebody raped you. You are suffering trauma. Yeah. And unless you figure out how to deal with that, you're not going to get through it. And so these sorts of things you need to strip away the details of someone's experience in order to be able to see yourself in those. Yeah. It was an Amazon review. If I don't blame him for putting his thing out there, but it did illustrate what I was trying to get at, which was just don't recognize that is a knee-jerk reaction that everybody has and move past it.
Right. Well, and again, I apologize to your father's buddies. I didn't mean to throw any of them under the bus there with that mistaken identity. And if you're listening out there, that Marine from my old squadron, I apologize for feeling the way I did about you now that having read that book. So, all right, folks, again, that's Continuing Actions. Author is Dan Sheehan. Highly recommend the book. You can get it on Amazon.com. So you've got 2 nonfiction books under your belt right now. One of them, you won a couple of awards that we had talked about in last week's episode. And it sounds like you got the bug, so you want to be an author. And now it sounds like you're on to something completely different. Why don't you go ahead and tell us as much as you can about your new project?
All right. Well, yes, I am. I've turned to writing fiction, and I've been working on my first fiction novel for probably a little over 2 years now. Steadily working on it for a little over 2 years. I've been brainstorming it for longer than that. and it's so much more fun than writing my nonfiction was.
Yeah.
Mostly because of the subject matter. I get to make shit up instead of having to live it and then try and make sense of it afterwards. But yeah, it's a contemporary fantasy novel that takes a couple of unfinished conflicts from Greek mythology and plays them forward into 1987, when they caused the collapse of an illegal U.S. government drug smuggling operation, and kind of ruins the lives of a couple of CIA mercenaries. That's about far enough for right now, but brings everything in.
How long do you think it'll take you to write it?
Well, I've just crossed over and begun the query process, so I'm actively seeking an agent to represent the book. So it's been through, I think I'm on the 8th rewrite, and so I've been working on the rewrites for over a year, and fine tuning the story, and it's the first of a three book series. So set the stage for 2 follow-on books, and I'm currently looking for an agent to represent them. That's awesome. So I've just started the query process and sending out letters, and this is one of the things that got me into, or maybe decided to try my hand at fiction, was the fact that I really enjoy the writing process. I enjoy the whole thing from coming up with a concept and plotting it out and making a storyboard and putting it all up and drawing the story and seeing where it goes. I enjoy that. I enjoy the actual physical process of writing and creating in front of the computer. And then I enjoy the editing. I enjoy going back through and going, this was fun to write, but it doesn't fit. So out it goes. And, taking out a lot of that stuff, weeding the garden, if you will. Yeah. And making that storyline tight and really resonate. I enjoy all of that. I do not like the query process. This is not fun. So this is the phase where I have to boil everything down. I have to boil me. I have to boil my writing and my book down into one page.
Really?
Try and get an agent who's got an inbox with several hundred of these in there. Try and get his or her attention like that, and make that agent go, yes, this is what I've been waiting my whole career for. Please send me more. So I really dislike this part of it, but it's part of the game.
Yeah. Is there a lot of research involved with this, or is it more just using your imagination type of thing?
I did do a lot of research on it, but it was research into things like hallucinogenic mushrooms and some of the stranger side myths from Greek mythology, and then a whole bunch of background on the Iran-Contra scandal and how that played out, just to provide some backstory for what I was fabricating. And I like that. I like the aspect of research that goes along with it, but I find that it's best if I dive deep into something and research it for a while and then don't try to write about it until it's gone from my short-term memory. Yeah. But then when I start writing that stuff, I pull out the important things without getting bogged down in the details.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I'll tell you what, it was great to talk to you again. Thank you very much for your time. I would love to get you back on as it gets closer to the novel coming out. But again, just to kind of close this out, the first 2 books that Dan wrote, After Action and Continuing Actions, are great. And if you're experiencing some of those difficulties that we just talked about today, aside from actually going out and getting professional help, this book was great. It's a great first step to kind of get you to get someone to figure out what it is they're experiencing, and then go from there. So the books are a great service to all of our vets, and I thank you for that. That's it for right now, Dan. I really appreciate your time. And before we close this out, Coming from both of us as both former Marine officers, if you're in the military, police, fire, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for everything you do. Stay safe. And until next time, this is Brian the Rain Man Lucas. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, Observations on the World We Live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.